Go for number 1. 3, 2, 1.
To look at Power Drift today in 2025 can admittedly look fairly messy, but it wasn't always that way. Sega released this very advanced kart racing game way back in 1988. At the time, this was absolutely groundbreaking stuff. This was a more advanced beast than Sega's earlier racers such as Outrun or Hang On. In fact, this was such an advanced and complex game, everything that you see apart from the backgrounds are sprites. And this of course is even more complex as it's also working from the Sega Y board. This allows everything within the game to rotate, and adding this fourth super scaling board into the mix, which is why today this game can sometimes look a little messy in places. There is a hell of a lot going on, and for 1988 this is a super impressive release. That's not to say that if you have the original arcade cabinet of Power Drift that this game looks messy. There is some games that aren't translated too well with emulation admittedly. Some games like this one definitely demands the real experience, which was originally set up a little like Outrun, a sit down cabinet with mounted steering wheel, pedals and shifter controls, although the main standard arcade issue for the game was an upright standing cabinet. So what do we get within the game Power Drift then? Well, we will say that this kart racer contains 5 themed main tracks. Each one of these contains 5 stages, so a total of 25 stages in total then. Like I said, this game is wholly impressive for its time. We have very colourful visuals, something that possibly Nintendo was inspired by a few years later with a certain kart game. In addition to the cheerful colours being used, we also get some very impressive music too, with some thumping sound effects which emulates the sound of engines revving. And this is all topped off with some really nice voice sampling too. The game itself is a fairly fast one too. Just remember, we do have the shifter to slow down or speed up. It's one of those racers that heads will turn as the car is turning with you. So with so many complexities and the impossible faults of this game being ported to particular systems, today we are ranking from worst to best the very best home conversion of Sega's 1988 racing classic Power Drift. You sometimes get terrible Atari ST ports of arcade games, then you get nice enough looking games which perform very badly, and this is definitely one of those games. Much like the next port in this video, this is almost the same in terms of colours and design, only this version is absolutely horrendous in terms of playing it. The major flaw with this version is the almost 5 FPS, and corners that are so tight to turn most of the time that we end up just crashing. Oh, we get no music here either, just very bad sound effects and an acceptable voice sample that counts the player into races.
Third lap.
You will see a parallel to the Atari ST version here. Take away the colours and the fairly good scaling looks of this Amiga 500 port and you have a fairly bad game. This has got to be one of the worst Amiga racers I've ever played, and I've played some fairly bad games in my time. Like I said, this game looks good for what it's actually being powered from, and even the music, sound effects and added voice sampling all sound really well.
Go!
The main issue here is the execution of the tracks in particular in this game. You can tolerate the odd track or two, but then it suddenly rings home that in fact this isn't enjoyable at all, and turning ridiculously tight corners with a fairly big car is very punishing. I mean, there are times where you can literally see the road to the left or right rather than it bending around corners to make things more coherent. Even if you are the most seasoned Amiga gamer or even a pro gamer in general, you will never get through these tracks without crashing. It's just impossible to do so, I swear. It really is that tight to take corners on successfully with this version. Now, as I was playing the game through, I even noticed that when too much is happening, for example racing up and down rocky hills or mountains on each side, the game slows down dramatically, in that the music and sound effects literally do not go alongside the gameplay. That's either poor coding behind the scenes or the coders themselves throwing far too much at this awesome 16-bit computer. computer. It's a real shame how Power Drift for Amiga ended up. A fairly great looking game that replicates that Sega Super Scaler look fairly well, but badly let down by controls and drifting around bends, which at times bends don't really exist. I've literally placed this Amiga version right next door to the ST port, as this version did not lag as much when playing, but altogether they're both fairly bad 16-bit computer versions. Yes, I did just put a mere ZX Spectrum game over the apparent superior computer versions. Why? Well, this is actually playable for starters. Okay, so it's not perfect by any means at all, but come on, this is Power Drift running on a Spectrum 128K computer. When I say that this is cut back, the gameplay footage will easily dictate this. Just remember, by no means at all did Sir Clive Sinclair expect his Spectrum computers to run games like this, and certainly not by 1989 when Activision released it. But there it was, and I suspect most kids and some adults might have found this port fairly playable. Like I said, by no means perfect, a very cut back version, but having said that, the developers of this version did manage to pull off the pseudo 3D effects when we travel up and down hills, and it actually doesn't look that bad for what it is. My only big quarrel with this 8-bit microport is that the roads are fairly narrow and the carts are fairly big, and so turning corners can be fairly difficult at times. The game comes with music as well as sound effects, so no issues here. They do the job and do it fairly well. I did, however, find the shift and acceleration a little strange. As for the presentation itself, this looks smart. A really nice mapped out menu screen where we can select controls and where we even get a fairly nice vector looking Power Drift logo appear before all this. We have 5 main theme stages just like in the arcade game, and selecting a stage to play as well as a character to play is really nicely presented here. Most certainly one of the Spectrum's more highly polished arcade ports that I've ever covered in this series. As we speed through the stages, colour clash can get a little overwhelming at times, but with a well-trained ZX Spectrum eye, you could likely bypass this altogether and enjoy it for what it is. Activision and their team produce an above average racer here for the ZX Spectrum. This arcade ports video is certainly full of surprises. Now, traditionally, MSX games are very bad ports of ZX Spectrum games, and I've seen some really poor examples of this happening within this series. But here we go, I actually think that this 1989 Activision game is a slight upgrade from the Spectrum's version. Firstly, we have a larger playing field area here, and it even appears to run better too. Turning corners with this MSX port is seamless too, as the tracks do appear to have a little more room to make some of these easier to get around. We do have the obvious colour clash, which can get a little messy at times, but just like the Spectrum game, it takes a very well trained eye to adjust to this. If you can get past this, then yeah, the MSX version is very good for this platform. Oddly enough, it's normally the Japanese releases for this platform which are normally the better games, but I will seriously give this version the credit that it deserves. This handles really nicely with joystick, it feels fairly tight to control, and hit collision detection ain't bad here. You certainly know when you have collided with another car or into the side of the road, as sound effects are fairly loud. We don't have any music though, and the sound effects do sound a little strange, but limitations of 8-bit machines are limitations, and the developers likely need to determine the music over gameplay in order to save some space. But if you had a hi-fi beside you in the late 1980s, you could have popped on a tape and blast away some Guns N' Roses whilst playing this to add to the effect. Power Drift for the Amstrad CPC is a seriously great effort from Activision, who released this for fans of the arcades game in 1989. It's one of those games that you might wonder if it was actually a direct port of the ZX Spectrum version or vice versa, as it looks pretty much the same in terms of its design. But of course this version has much more colour and much more easier on the eye too. Spectrum and Amstrad are no stranger to having ports of each other's games, but regardless, this is a superb racing game for the CPC and probably one of the best on this 8-bit micro. It handles really well, and even going through those more busy areas where we are racing on top of hills with mountains beside us, the CPC refuses to struggle with these parts, and it runs fairly good with a consistent speed too. A seriously impressive game for the CPC, and if you had this machine back in the day, you likely would have enjoyed this game, and I hope for your sake that you had a colour monitor, as these colours really do pop out. They look awesome. Do you love the idea of emulating games from yesteryear on your modern day computer or portable device? Maybe you hate the thought of loading times of your favourite games and prefer to watch commentary videos or anything else retro related. Just Jamie Retro Realm is the ultimate channel for anybody who loves games from the golden age of arcade to home microcomputers, as well as the console generations. From the 1970s to the 2000s, then this channel will have something that you'll love, including themed video series, as well as beginner's guides from standalone emulators to more complex front-end emulation system guides. This channel even supports and showcases modern day games for retro platforms, or more commonly known as homebrew games, as well as offering reviews for physical hardware. Just Jamie will absolutely have something for any preference, and the video uploads are also very frequent too. So if you want a retro gaming channel which appreciates everything from the Sinclair ZX80 to the modern day era arcade games, and love the idea of discovering new games from yesteryear, hit subscribe and set notifications so you don't miss out on almost daily content.
3, 2, 1, go!
Next up, we have the MS-DOS 1990 port of Power Drift. Now, I was pleasantly surprised with this version. Many DOS arcade ports have generally been fairly bad. I cannot get out of my head how terrible Bad Dudes and Robocop was when I covered those. But this is actually a fairly decent version of this game, again by Activision, and most definitely one of the better arcade ports for DOS. I set this up with DOSBox, and to my knowledge I've set this up correctly in terms of CPU speeds. I also use a particular sound card to emulate, which gives us voice samples, which admittedly doesn't sound too bad at all here. I also use the best video settings. Now as for the game itself, of course this is an extremely cut back version, but the developers behind this version haven't gone too mad in imitating that Super Scaler look. Hills when racing up and down look a little flat, but we can tell we are in the air as the planes on the right and left hand sides disappear. Default difficulty settings are way too easy though, and I did find myself overlapping other carts, which is a little strange because most other ports I've played I find I'm overlapped myself. In terms of colour, this looks really nice and sprite design is pretty spot on too. Well, as far as a 1990 DOS machine could do. The opening presentation could have been better, but really this is all about the gameplay, and this plays fairly well with no frame drop issues at all. I must have played 4 of the 5 stages and everything seemed to perform reasonably well. We don't get the whole 3D effect before beginning races where the camera swoops around the track, but as of now the only ones that did do that so far are the Amiga and the Atari ST versions, and the gameplay execution on both of those was fairly pitiful. The past few 8-bit micro versions have all looked very similar. Then we have this Commodore 64 version which also released in 1990. One thing is for sure, the disc version of Power Drift here is a super long loader. But when we actually get into the game, this is when waiting a couple of minutes feel like it has definitely been worth watching those wobbly raster bars load up. Firstly, we have a full screen here and everything looks very higher end in production. It's often said that Turbocharge is one of the better C64 racing games, but I personally think even Power Drift rivals that game easily. What makes this game a little better than most so far in this video is that Chris Butler, who coded it for Activision, hasn't gone too mad with making the Commodore 64 attempt to do something it could simply not do. And so the tracks that we race on are fairly basic looking. In other words, any attempts to make roads look like Super Scaler roads, which rotate, aren't here. Having said that, we still have the pseudo 3D effect, passing particular roadside sprites, and that is what makes this port more interesting than most. Each track that we race here do have a different appearance with how they look, rather than looking samey. We also get a thumping soundtrack with this as we play by Dave Lowe, and in true Sig Chip style, this really does sound awesome. Our carts are fairly nice to control and nothing tends to lag in this game. It scrolls beautifully and the colours used are fairly good here, where many C64 colours can look pretty dull in comparison to other systems of this time. It's an enjoyable kart racing game for sure, and what makes this embarrassing is that most would agree that Commodore's younger brother, the Amiga's version, should have been superior to this, but it simply wasn't. This is a seriously fun version of Power Drift, which even has the player properly spin around when being hit just like in the arcade game. This was a difficult version of the game to rank. This is of course the Japanese release for PC Engine. This does differ from the arcade game itself, and it's also very different from everything else that had a port of the game. We choose our character to play as from selecting from a wheel, and then I expected to select a theme stage, which at this point I have been used to doing. But here we do not get to select a race, the races are automated here. The thing with this version, which Sega released in 1990, is that the carts do appear to be fairly large, and this really kicks in from the start of races. If you are positioned at the back of a race, you will constantly crash as other carts are hard to avoid, as they are also too large. In terms of looks, then yeah, this PC Engine port looks the part for sure. There's no doubt about that, and the music and sound effects are also top notch too, complete with voice sampling. Looking back on the previous games so far in this video, largely the games which actually played fairly well were very cut back versions. The Commodore 64 and Spectrum versions for example. But here this appears to be the PC Engine pushing everything to max level. It most certainly looks like a quality production. The real issue is that although this looks gorgeous, I cannot help but think it would be so much better if the sizes of carts were toned down. Hit collision detection here is on maximum overdrive too. One tiny scratch will cause you to crash. This is definitely one of the more difficult ports of the game for sure. Handling the game is fairly straightforward here. D-pad up and down shifts gear to high and low, whereas action button accelerates. I think all in all this is a fairly good version of Power Drift. It's likely that more practice is needed with this one in regards to taking on corners, which can really demand some braking compared with everything else so far. Between 2015 and 2016, Sega 3D Classics Collection was released for the Nintendo 3DS. This included several arcade classics in one package, although here we are looking obviously at the included version of Power Drift. This is a very nice portable recreation of the 1988 game. Now, although personally I don't think this is as good as it could have been, that's not to say that this isn't great. The reasoning that this could have been better is simply that the game plays far too fast for its own good, running at a faithful 60 FPS. Visually, this game looks great, and it also features several options with the ability to customize controls, and also gives us a manual or auto option for shift gear changes. It of course comes with the option to play in 3D or 2D. I selected the 2D option for this video, and will say again, like in Galaxy Force, 3D isn't for everybody. Although if that's your thing, then check out the 3D mode, which some would love. Before we get to first place in today's video, this is a special honourable mention for the Sega Dreamcast emulated game, which was a Japanese exclusive featured in Yu Suzuki Gameworks Volume 1. Now obviously it wouldn't make sense in ranking this as the game has been emulated, with likely some form of MAME emulation. Anyways, this released in 2001 and it's a nice little package for any Sega Dreamcast collector. Now, I was totally convinced that this Japanese Sega Saturn release was just an emulated version of the arcade game itself. After further analysis and research, note this is actually a port and it is a superb port too, and that's why I put this in first place. Let's be honest though, apart from this Saturn version and the 3DS version, everything else was fairly underpowered to take on such a task as Power Drift. This was released as part of the Sega Ages collection, and Japanese owners would have been very delighted with this awesome port back in 1998. In fact, Japanese players would have been delighted with most of the Sega Ages releases. It also contains the awesome port of Galaxy Force, which I did in my last arcade ports video. So, what makes this version so great? Well, even by 1998 standards of hardware, and this game being 10 years old at this point, this would have been a huge task for Sega to pull off, but they did it well. So we have an options menu here, including 2 modes to play, one being the main arcade mode, and we also have a Grand Prix mode too. We have difficulty settings and also an option to change shift gears between manual and automatic. A really great feature here is that this port also supports Sega Saturn's 3D controller for analog support, and this works perfectly with this game, which I highly recommend. This game runs at a steady 30 FPS. Sure, it isn't great as the arcades version, but it holds its own, and really what is more technically impressive here is the amount of sprites being used and how the Saturn is capable enough to support so much happening. In terms of music and sound effects, I would say that these sound a little more enhanced and a little more chunky compared to the classic 1988 release. I mean, really, this game is so good to play, and like I said, I actually thought this was an emulated version of the original game. The screen even rotates too as you turn left and right. An absolutely phenomenal port here. And that's it for ranking every version of Power Drift today. Now, let me just add that the Mega Drive, Sega CD, and the Sega 32X were all to receive ports of Power Drift, but were all ultimately cancelled. A real shame. I'm fairly sure the Sega 32X in particular could have done this game some real good justice. In fact, the Sega 32X version was actually in development, as well as the Sega CD version. But anyways, let us know in the comments if you agreed with today's ranking, and if you're new to the series, I'm going to leave a link in the comments section so you can check out the previous arcade ports videos. Anyways, until next time, thanks for watching and stay retro.